Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lean in the Landscape, presented by Ben Gandy. This webinar is hosted by the National Association of Landscape Professionals. My name is Lori Langford, and I will be the moderator. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. First, we encourage you to use the chat panel located in the bottom right-hand corner of the control panel on your screen. To ask a question, click on the chat box and type in your request. Then click the Send Privately box and direct your questions to me, Lori Langford. We'll answer your questions towards the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, we'll follow up with you via email. All telephone lines are on mute for this call. This webinar is being recorded. If you're a member of the National Association of Landscape Professionals, you may access it online in the Member Center section starting next week. And now, I'll turn the presentation over to Ben.
Thank you so much, Lori. Welcome, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you with us this afternoon. I have been in the landscape industry for over 30 years at this point, and I have been studying Lean and the applications of Lean philosophy and Lean concepts in landscaping for over a decade now. And at this point in my career, I've had an opportunity to travel to almost every market in the nation and talk about and think about Lean applications and how we can optimize the work that we do. Today, what I really want to talk about just some basic introductory ideas that are associated with Lean, and at least one basic tool or concept where you can take those ideas and practically and tactically apply them out in the landscape. When I think about Lean, I think about the operational side of the business, and I do believe that on the operations, there is sort of a sequence or a cycle of activities that we have to be competent at. It's all about building the capabilities of the people that are out there, providing the value to our customers. It's about leadership and about time management. And there's some hard skills, some definite waypoints in the life of the customer that managing operations, you have to be expert in. You have to understand the contracts. In fact, if you're on the line and you've never really read the contract, then ignore all the indemnifications and payment clauses and insurance requirements, but find the scope to understand exactly what it is that we're supposed to be providing the customers, because that's really kind of the starting point. Understand, hopefully, how to have a good onboarding process with your customers, but then in terms of managing operations, I think that the things that the guys out in the field are responsible for or in control of is safety and quality and productivity. There's a lot of things that they're not in control of, but those three things they are in control of, and so are the management personnel that are on the line today in terms of being effective with those guys. And then being successful involves being good at training, being good at scheduling, and labor management, and that's where Lean comes in. Labor management starts as a business process and understanding your finances and your budget, but then it does boil down past that to the job level and the task level, and that's really where Lean comes in. And let me give you a little bit of background on Lean as I understand it. 100 years ago, Toyota company was a textile manufacturer, and for whatever reason, they started making vehicles back before World War II. They made lightweight trucks. After World War II, Toyota decided that there was no future in textile manufacturing, that they needed to put their focus on vehicle manufacturing, and they had an enormous hill to climb. They had no money. Japan was recovering from a lost war. And at the time, 90% of every vehicle that was sold in the world was manufactured by either Ford or General Motors. So they had tremendous obstacles to overcome. They got a little bit of help from the United States. The United States sent over some folks after World War II, a guy named Edward Demings and some other people that went over with him to teach Japanese manufacturing base a little bit about how we understood as Americans manufacturing at the time. And those people stayed in country for about 10 years. They left, and for whatever reason, Toyota seemed to just get this message about how to do manufacturing well better than anybody. And they began actually importing cars to the United States in the 1970s. They were much smaller and lighter weight than anything that Ford or General Motors was manufacturing at the time, but they were reasonably durable. The price was right. They were very fuel efficient comparatively. And by the 1980s, they really began to significantly gain market share on their competitors. And by the 1990s, they were beating up Ford and General Motors so bad that people were getting on airplanes, flying to Japan, and trying to figure out how on earth can you make a car in a nation that has virtually no natural resources, put it on a boat, ship it to America across the Pacific Ocean, and sell it here for less money than you can manufacture a car locally. And besides that, it was a better car. So they came back with a body of knowledge that in English is called lean manufacturing. And lean does not stand for anything. It's not an acronym. It's just a reference to this work that Toyota had been thinking about for 50 years at that point, about how to do work, how to manufacture a product with the highest level of safety, the highest level of quality, the highest level of productivity. And we call that lean. And I want to talk about a specific foundational point that they really played upon at Toyota and many other organizations that have initiated a lean strategy inside their businesses. It's this idea that was developed by an engineer called Takeuchi Ono that there are three elements of work. Any type of work that we go do, there are kind of three elements to it. There's value added, and the value added piece of the work is what the customer is paying for, what they really want. There's incidental activity. You know, if we are going out to mow grass that needs mowing, that's value added. But when we're going out there, on the way out there, the mobilization to the job site is incidental. The customer doesn't really get any value for that. There's nothing physically changing on the customer's job site when we're driving out there. However, it's kind of a necessary part of the job. It's difficult to eliminate that part of the job. And then there's waste. There's waste where we actually don't accomplish anything, and we don't even need to do that piece of the work. It's a pretty simple concept that Ono had many, many years ago, and he just kept building on it because it's powerful. The powerful piece of that concept is that the key to productivity is not trying to make people work harder. The key to productivity is trying to reduce or eliminate the incidental and the waste. Productivity will take care of itself if you can learn to identify and reduce or eliminate the incidental or the waste. The example that I've given for years and years has been, you know, if I'm washing my truck and I got the sponge in my hand and I'm trying to take the grime off the truck, that's value added. The truck is getting cleaner in the process. But when I'm putting water in the bucket, it's incidental. The truck's not getting any cleaner when I'm just making the soapy water. And if I go to the house and get a beer, it's completely waste unless you have different priorities. So if I could figure out how to fill the bucket faster, if I could fill the bucket with a fire hose, I could shrink the incidental and I could be more productive. If I could figure out how to wash a truck without going to the house and get a beer, then I could eliminate some of the waste. If I could figure out how to wash the truck without filling the bucket at all, then I could be more productive, basically without having to work any harder. Let me give you a couple of examples of that kind of playing out. You know, when you think of somebody changing the paper in the copy machine, there's a picture of somebody changing the paper in a copy machine. It's a sequential activity. It's very simple. You go get the paper, you open the drawer, you put the paper in the drawer, and you close the drawer, and you push the button. 4 or 5 steps. The only value added step there is putting the paper in the drawer. Going to get the paper doesn't add any value. Opening the drawer doesn't add any value. What adds value is putting the paper in. The process really doesn't move forward until you put the paper in. So if you could shrink or eliminate any of the incidental that's associated with that task, then you could be more productive. If you could keep the paper closer to the copy machine, if you could put the whole ream of paper in there at one time, those are just simple steps that shrink or eliminate some of the incidental activity, and they drive productivity. Another example might be replacing an irrigation head. If when you drive to the job site, you locate the head, you dig it up, you remove the old head, you throw it away, you install a new head, you put the dirt back in the hole, you tamp down the sod, you adjust and nozzle it up, and then you turn it on. The only value-added piece to that work is actually installing the new head. The customer won't pay us until we install the new head. All the other pieces of the work are incidental. If the crew could direct report to the job, you could eliminate the driving to the job site. If you were careful to make sure that the crewmen, when they're finding the sites, had all their materials with them so they didn't have to walk back and forth to the truck, then you eliminate a certain amount of the incidental. I live in Georgia where the soils are very clay-like in northern Georgia, and a lot of times you don't even really have to dig the hole. You can just sort of wallow it out, unscrew it. I'm in Florida today where the soils are sandy and the holes will collapse pretty quick, so you can't really get away with it in this market. But all those are ways that you could reduce the incidental and drive up productivity, and nobody works any harder in those circumstances. So it's a simple concept, but the more that I've thought about it over the years, the more I realize there's so many ways that you can build on that. For the most part, the guys that work for us work hard. Trying to make them work harder has really limited efficacy, really limited value. Trying to figure out how to eliminate the waste has huge value. So the enemy of productivity is waste. And the people that have really studied this and looked at it for years and years and years have said, you know, you can categorize waste that's out there in 7 different ways. You can categorize it as overprocessing, overproduction, defects or rework, transportation, inventory, motion, and waiting. And I want to go through these a little bit, because if you can identify these and you can put a name around them, then you can begin to qualify the waste that's out there on the job sites. If you can qualify it, you can come up with countermeasures and figure out how to reduce or eliminate it. Overprocessing and overproduction and rework a lot of times are stimulated by customer demand. Not always, but many times they are. And transportation, inventory, and motion and waiting a lot of times are triggered by our own internal processes or lack thereof. Not always, but often. So let me give you some examples. Here's an example or a couple of examples actually, of overproduction. Overproduction is too much, too soon, too fast, or doing work that just does not need to be done. It's out of scope. And here's a couple of examples. In the right-hand corner top, there's a guy that this is Northern California. It's a 52-week market. We were early in the morning at a a retail parking lot, and he had blown the whole parking lot. Took about an hour and a half, and when we got down, he had a little bit of leaf litter left over. That's about it. At some point later in that day, the manager I was working with and I met with the property manager and got to talking and said something about blowing the parking lot off. And she said, "Gosh, what's happening? I thought my sweeper truck was supposed to be there at 4:30 every morning to sweep the parking lot. Are they not showing up? You guys are not responsible for cleaning the parking lot." So we realized that we had been doing work that's out of scope. Now, the guy worked hard. He was trying to do a great job, but it's waste because it's out of scope. It's non-value add. And in that case, we had been visiting that job site once a week for 5 years, spending an hour and a half blowing off the parking lot that the customer did not care about. So it's overproduction. It's doing work that just doesn't need to be done. Another example is these guys that are cleaning up these shrubs that have been cut down. They have a skid steer on that site and a chain and a dumpster, a 30-yard dumpster. And they're chaining up these shrubs and jerking them out of the ground with a skid steer and dropping them into the dumpster because they were going to sod the site, carry the sod line all the way to the sidewalk. The overproduction is cutting down the shrubs. I got there about 9:30 in the morning and was sort of pulling out my hair. Why on earth did you cut down the shrubs? Because they'd spent, at this point, all morning, 3 guys, cleaning up all the debris from the chainsaw work that they did first when it just wasn't necessary. All we needed to do was chain up those shrubs, jerk them out of the ground, drop them in the dumpster. It's not that they weren't working hard. It's just that the cutting down the shrubs had no value. The value is laying the sod. And they put more steps between where we were starting and laying down the sod than were necessary. So it's overproduction. Here's a guy that's blowing off a curb in a residential development where you can see that the turf is dormant. It's winter time, so it hasn't been mowed, and it looks perfectly clean to me. And in fact, I was there, and it was clean. You know, and you kind of have to scratch your head and think, well, why was he doing that? And I believe the answer is because one of us told him to do that. I mean, you know, he's not trying to do something that he doesn't believe has value. He's trying to do just the opposite. He's trying to make his boss happy, but he's not really providing any value. It's just doing work because somebody told me to go do something, or I'm trying to look busy, rather than really adding value. And I think, unfortunately, we do that too much in our industry. Here's a gentleman who's doing some pruning, and he's not completing the task. He's actually just starting the task. It's some Yopan holly in front of a commercial development. And if, you know, I looked at these shrubs before he started and looked at them after he finished, and there's really no perceptible difference. He wasn't taking enough material off to really make any difference. The only difference was the cleanup. Now, because there's little itty bitty tiny material, it's very hard to clean up. It just didn't need to be done. It's just overproduction, not for lack of effort, but for lack of direction and lack of understanding really what the value was in the process. Overprocessing is another type of waste. Overprocessing is really doing the job too good. Obviously, when we're working with our crews, we want to be very, very careful about doing a great job. But you can do some jobs too well. I know that I have dug a hole before receiving hole for a tree, and then looked at the hole and kind of rounded it out with a shovel and make sure the edges are nice and smooth, and it's a good looking hole. And that's over processing. It doesn't really matter. The tree doesn't care. Nobody's ever going to see that hole but me after the tree goes in. In fact, as soon as the tree gets planted, the hole will cease to exist and never exist again. So it only needs to be deep enough and wide enough. It doesn't have to be pretty, and making it pretty is over processing. This photo of this ditch, we were doing some irrigation installation, and the guys set aside the ditch witch because it was real muddy. You can see the water flow into the ditch, and it was up next to a fence, which they didn't want to risk the machine damaging the fence. So they hand dug in the mud this trench, and it's perfect. You can put a laser down that trench. It's awesome, particularly considering the muddy conditions, but it's way over processing. All we're going to do is put in a piece of PVC pipe and cover it up. Over processing is doing the work too good. And I think there's a couple of areas, particularly in landscape maintenance, where we over process a lot. And that's with weed eating and with blowing. I think that without careful controls and instructions, that crews can go out there and way over process, and therefore waste, and therefore lose productivity by overuse of those particular tools. I was at a job site in fall in Massachusetts, and asked a guy with a vacuum mower to run around the job site and pick the leaves up off the turf. And he very carefully moved the picnic table that you can see in this picture and put it back. There's no leaves under the picnic table. It's over processing. Besides that, there's still leaves in the trees. We're going to have to do this every week for a period of time. So over processing is really doing the work kind of too good. Rework is another form of waste. Rework is when we screw it up and we forget something, or we do it wrong, or we fail to satisfy a client in some way, and we got to turn around and go back out and do the work again. And 100% of rework is waste. The labor is waste, the material is waste, and there's an opportunity cost that's associated with that as well, because we're not producing new value with that crew. We're going back to reproduce value that we've already produced one time. We're not going to get paid to do it again. So anything that we can do to keep us out of performing rework contributes to productivity. Transportation is a form of waste. And look, in our business, we have a lot of transportation. We service real estate, so we spend a lot of time in the trucks. In fact, I do believe that there are some companies out there that spend as much as 20% of their labor hours just in transportation. But there's nothing physically changing on the customer's job sites in transportation. So thinking about traffic patterns, crew sizes, thinking about mobilization hard really does pay us back, particularly in our industry. It's not just the waste of the guys that are driving around out there, but there's also a safety risk with being on the road. We burn fuel when we're out there. And if you got, 3 guys in a truck for 20 minutes, it's an hour. It's an entire hour of productivity that we've lost that we can't get back. 3 guys for 40 minutes is 2 hours gone. And speaking of transportation, there's one study that I was involved in at one point, just somewhat of an aside. We actually tracked via GPS units the transportation habits of a set of managers, about 30 managers in the Denver metropolitan region for a year at one point, and discovered a couple of things that were interesting. One of them was that the average miles per year, work miles, not commute miles, but work miles, it's about 20,000 miles a year, which seemed about right. The average speed was surprising. The average speed was about 20 miles an hour or less, which surprised me because I know it seems like that we drive around at 50 or 60 miles an hour or more all the time, but we really don't. We spend a lot of time at traffic lights and in traffic jams and in parking lots and on side roads, and your average speed is nowhere near your top speed. And the math says that if you travel 20,000 miles at 20 miles an hour, that you actually spend 1,000 hours a year in the truck. That's a lot of time. So when you're thinking about transportation waste, think about the crews, dispatch time, traffic patterns, crew sizes, direct report, but also think about yourself and your management team, because you don't really provide a whole lot of value when you're riding around. Motion is can be a form of waste if it's not adding value. An example here is on the left with the red line is the path of motion of a guy with a blower in a parking lot at a commercial building in the middle of the day. And all the squiggles, I was looking at it and thinking, oh my gosh, there's a lot of walking around. All the squiggles are him trying to get sort of in and out of the cars to blow to get all the debris out from underneath the cars. It made all kinds of sense to change the schedule around and try to service this particular building early in the morning as we possibly could before the parking lot filled up. And on top of that, we're going to think about it, it's a fairly flat parking lot. Let's, instead of doing it with a backpack blower, let's just do it with a street blower with a little wonder of billy goat that the guy can push around. And that's the blue line that you see right next to it. You're accomplishing the exact same thing. It's just blowing a parking lot. It shouldn't be complicated. But by changing the dispatch time, changing the equipment piece, drove down the waste and up the productivity tremendously. These guys are going to plant about 300 flats of begonias at a shopping mall. And good guys, working hard. They did a great job. But I had to question, why on earth were we unloading all of those plants in the parking lot? Because if you unload them as they're doing, then you're going to have to reload them back on that dump truck in the background, and then you're going to have to unload them again at the flower bed. So you're going to handle all 300 flats at least 3 times with this approach. And every time that you handle them, it's non-value added. In fact, the only value in this type of operation or ending planting operation is when the flower's in the ground. Every prior step is non-value add. So eliminating the prior steps drives up productivity. In this case, we stopped what we were doing and asked the delivery driver just to drive through the site, and we drop flower beds at every flower bed. We dropped the flats off so that we wouldn't have to multi-handle the flats any more than we had already committed to at this point. Thinking about motion, I think, is particularly critical in installation jobs. Every piece of material, whether it be rock or mulch or plants or anything, the only value is the final placement. Every prior movement of material is non-value add, and you can really drive up productivity in installation jobs by being very, very particular about your logistics, so that material comes from delivery trucks to final placement, ideally with one handling. Every 2 handlings is 50% less productive, so something to think about. I was actually at a job site in Louisiana with some guys mowing some apartment communities, and we got to talking about motion waste. We were talking about a lot of things, but they had some folks on stand-on mowers mowing the front of these units, and somebody made the comment to me, it said every time we cross over a sidewalk, it's non-value added. We're just cutting concrete, which I had never really thought about before, but they were right. It's not value added. Would it be more productive to cut a panel and then cross the sidewalk once and then cut the next panel and then cross the sidewalk once and cut the next panel, so that you didn't have the non-value added of passing over the sidewalk, which didn't need to be mowed. And I told him, and I said, I have no idea. I've never even thought about it, but I got a stopwatch on my phone, and so do you. So let's just time a guy. There's 30 buildings out here, and they're all landscaped about the same. So we did. We spent the next 20 minutes. We mowed a couple of buildings one way, mowed a couple of buildings the other way. And as you might guess, it's more productive to make the sweep all the way across, as long as you don't mark up the sidewalks, to sweep all the way across and minimize your turns, because turns are non-value added. It's motion that doesn't add value. And when you cut one panel at a time, you introduce a lot of motion. So a lot of non-value added motion. In our business, there's an awful lot of activities that we do that are on your feet. Weeding and blowing and pruning and planting and weed control. And unless you're in a skid steer or you're riding a mower, your crews are on their feet in one way or another. So thinking about how they travel through the site, whether it's doing landscape maintenance or construction or any task out there, can add a lot to your productivity. Deadheading in any way, turning them over, anything like that is non-value add. Inventory can be a form of waste. It's not the biggest form of waste, I don't believe, in the landscape industry. It's a very big issue in manufacturing, so there's a lot of thought in the manufacturing environment around it. But in landscaping, I do think that there are a couple of areas where we manage inventory and where it behooves us to sort of think about it. One of them was with plant inventories. In my travels and in my work, I have come to the conclusion that as landscapers, we kind of suck at holding plant material. I meet a few landscapers every now and then that are pretty good at it, but most of them are not. I was not when I was running operations. In fact, I believe that most of the plant hold areas that we have are not so much plant hold areas as they are plant hospices where we take plants to go die. So I would encourage you to minimize plant hold areas, because I feel like that plants, unless you do it professionally, they lose their ornamental value, and therefore they lose their resale value pretty quickly when you hold them. So I would try to minimize that. In fact, I even believe that, if you sell somebody, I'm down in Florida today, if you sell somebody 30 Indian hawthorns and you put 27 of them in the bed and it looks great, I think there's more value in finding a good place for the 3 remainders and snapping a picture and sending it to your client and telling them you've given them something extra than there is in trying to save those 3 Indian hawthorns, putting them back on the truck, taking them back to the shop, unloading them and then watering them. If you can sell them quickly to somebody else, great, but 9 times out of 10, they end up sitting in the plant hold area for 2 years before we actually throw them away. So that's kind of my current belief on managing plant inventory. And the other area that we have some risk with inventory is with chemicals and fertilizers, agronomic products. We don't do well. Those materials are much more durable than plants, obviously. Where we sometimes trip up is managing open containers. I kind of think at this point in my career, if I sent somebody out to fertilize a property with 12 bags of granular fert and they spread 11.5 bags, just throw that other half a bag in the hopper and go back over the frontage and double up on it, rather than taking that half a bag back to the shop, because inevitably, if you take it back to the shop, it's going to get wet. It's going to turn into this fertilizer brick that we can't do anything with, and it's going to sit around the shop for years. So that's an area, there's 2 areas, agronomic product management and living plant material management, where you can potentially have waste associated with inventory. And then finally, the last form of waste is weighting. Weighting is obviously non-productive. But here's the interesting thing about weighting. What's challenging about this is that all of these forms of waste really look like production. Over-processing looks like production, overproduction looks like production. Looks like you're doing something. Rework looks like work. Transportation looks like going to do work. Inventory looks like stuff to do work with. The only form of waste that really does not look like work is waiting. Waiting looks non-productive, and it is non-productive. But all the other forms of waste don't look like waste. They look like work. They disguise themselves as work. So the key is, the trick is to really, I believe, get out on the job sites and look at what's going on and do it objectively. This is not a means to beat up on the guys. It's a means to think about, and I spent a lot of my career in the past 10 years doing this. It's a means to think about what's the waste, what's the value, how can I eliminate the waste? How can we reduce the waste? There's waste in everything that we do. Waiting's pretty easy to see, but the other ones really require sort of standing there and watching the activity and thinking, what are we doing that adds no value here? And it's not a 2-minute process. I really believe it's a 5-minute, 20-minute, sometimes an hour or more process of watching the work and thinking about what's the value, what's the waste, how can I eliminate the waste? I think it's extremely powerful. It's a little bit weird to stand and watch other people work, but there's no better way to understand what your crews know, what they're good at, what they don't know, what they're not good at, than to spend some time watching the work actually take place. And when you do see the waste out there, I've given a lot of thought over the years to think about what's the root cause. Why do we have waste on the work sites? And in every work site, you got equipment, you got materials, you got people, you got processes, and invariably, it goes back, I think, to people and processes, because it goes back to training and planning. The people that don't understand exactly the best way to deliver the value, or even what the value is, or planning, they haven't been properly equipped and set up to deliver the value with the least amount of effort. I believe that the countermeasure, the most powerful countermeasure to waste, to combating the waste that's out in the job sites, is planning. Because planning, when you have good planning tools, it facilitates training. So the more you plan, the less you're actually less time you will theoretically spend actually doing anything. And the more you plan, the better opportunity you have to communicate why you're thinking what you're thinking. And you can make your crews stronger and faster and better in the process. I often, when I talk to people about productivity, about lean, we talk about one of the easiest places to exploit these ideas has to do with weekly mow services, because they're repetitive, so you do the same thing kind of over and over and over again. So if you figure out the best way to do it, you get a lot of leverage out of that activity. And when I think about planning, I think that it's so important to be good at planning. And to be good at planning means to understand and communicate what's the scope, to think about the sequence of activities that need to take place, what equipment will be necessary, think about time on multiple dimensions, times in terms of the man hours involved, also time in terms of scheduling. There are some properties that are more productive to do it at certain days of the week or times of the day than others. Retail, as early in the morning as you possibly can. Hotel, middle of the day. These are safer and more productive times to service these properties. And then people, how many people and what kind of skill sets that you need. And sometimes I'll challenge folks with just a simple activity. This illustration is a freestanding building in a parking lot, and it's got parking islands and a little bit of landscape around the building. And how should we do that job? And a lot of times, even with 10 or 12 or more people in the room, it'll turn into a 20-minute debate about the 16 best ways to do this job, which is kind of amusing because it's about the simplest work that we possibly do. A freestanding building in the parking lot doesn't get any easier than that. How can there be that many opinions about how to do the work? But the fact is that there's a lot of options with equipment, with sequence, with the people that are involved. There's a lot of questions that you have to have answers. You have to know the scope, know the customer's priorities, know the hours of operations, know where to park, know a lot of things. And when you really start to dig in, you realize that the work that we do is can be complicated. It's more complicated than you might think. One of the ways to cut through the complication that I've explored over the years is to think about organizing the work in terms of a Gantt chart. And here's an example of a Gantt chart. A Gantt chart just is a chart that has time across the horizontal axis and people across the vertical axis, and then a task in the middle. And in this particular Gantt chart, there's 2 guys on a push mower for 30 minutes. There's 1 guy on an edger for 30 minutes. 1 guy grabs a walk behind, looks like for 30 minutes. Somebody does some pruning, so that every task is organized between every person, and there's a sequence represented about what gets done first, and then what gets done next, and then what gets done next. And there's nothing magic about the Gantt chart. It's a pretty simple process, but what it does is it represents the best plan to do the work, and it facilitates you communicating the best plan and talking to your crews why. Why does this plan make more sense than any other plan? The power that you can get from that is that if you have a crew leader that leaves, or you sell some more work and you have to take a great crew leader and move them to a different job, you don't have to recreate the wheel. You already have a plan that's established that you can replicate and take your next crew. It's in writing, and you can communicate how the best way to do this job is. If you happen to lose a crew member, then you can plug in that missing person back into the same plan, and again, you don't have to recreate the wheel. To create a Gantt chart for either a maintenance job or an installation job does require that you know the task times for the specific functions that got to be done on the site, and that you spend a little bit of time thinking about that. But it is a very powerful way to get at the root cause of waste, because it's planning and it facilitates training. And if you do it enough, I've done it a great deal over the years, you get kind of good at it and becomes second nature, and it gives you a lot of power in understanding what kind of equipment do I really need, how many mowers do I need, how many skid steers, how many, kind of whatever do I need, how many people. Sometimes more people is not more productive, and the Gantt chart will clearly show that when you begin to organize it. It's a great tool if you can develop some competency there for planning and for eliminating waste in the process. There is one other tool that's important, and that's also a map, thinking about on a site plan just how everybody should move around the site. I happened to mention motion waste earlier in this presentation. We walk a lot in the things that we do, sometimes miles and miles a day. So thinking about how people move through a site is also important. And if you have the 2 pieces, a Gantt chart and a map about how people move, 2 pieces of a plan, then I think you're well equipped to really optimize productivity and minimize waste. Here's an example of a path of motion that I was working with a crew that was maintaining a very large site. It's a site that had actually 1,400 individual homes, and they serviced every single one of them every week. And I was trying to illustrate a path of motion for the guy that had to do the edge. This is in the southeastern United States. Stoloniferous grasses, where you have to edge the sidewalk and the driveway and the curb pretty frequently, every week or every other week. And so I had illustrated, how to go up and down the street with an edger. And fortunately, I was working with a guy that's a whole lot smarter than I am. That's not hard to find. But Christian said, no way, man. When we're here, this is the way that we edge. We cross the driveway, and then you go and cross the sidewalk, and then you edge that little strip between the curb and the sidewalk, and then you go over to the next house, and you cross the driveway, and then you do the little strip out by the road, and you go to the next house. And then, Christian, what difference does it make? And he said, man, if I do it your way, I've got to cross every driveway out here 3 times, and the driveways are 18 to 20 feet wide, and there's 1,400 of them. And if I do it my way, I cross the driveway 1 time, and I cross the sidewalk twice, and it's way more productive. Miles that you shave off of walking. And I got to give the guy credit. What a brilliant realization that that path of motion really was clever, and it leveraged a great deal of non-value added motion. So when I think about path of motion, I think about where do we park, how do we move, who goes where, and literally illustrate it on a site map or on a satellite image. Here's an image of Ipswich Country Club. It's up in Massachusetts. It's a beautiful development. When I pulled up to the job site, there were 3 riding mowers in 1 yard. I'm like, well, this is not productive. So we mapped out, who goes where and what they do. Here's some other examples and samples of just mapping out job sites. I've got one example. I'm just going to kind of scroll through quickly. Sun City, Peachtree is a Del Webb development south of Atlanta. I worked with a team down there a couple of years ago. And when I was called into the site, the customer was very unhappy. The project didn't look very good. The account manager that was managing the site was unhappy because it was very chaotic. Didn't have a good plan. And he's kind of chasing his tail. And the owner was very unhappy because we weren't making any money on the job. The margins were in the 30s. So it was very much a non-performer. So, I spent some time with the account manager there mapping out specifically what would we do every day. Where should we park the truck? What should the path of motion be per activity? What's the best way to do everything that we do, and how should we attack the common areas? What do we want to do about a pruning plan? How do we want to Gantt out the first, second, third activities, et cetera, with the crews that we have? How should we spread out all the activities across the year? All that took a pretty good bit of time to put it. It probably took us about 4 days to put all that together. But at the end of the day, we shared all that information with the client and went to work on it. And that single season, the margin improved by almost 10 points. The client calmed down and became a whole lot happier. The project looked better. And just as important as anything else, I think that the quality of life for the guy managing that job went way up. And all we did through all that planning process was eliminate a heck of a lot of non-value add so that we could concentrate on the value and have some consistency with the process. And I know this illustration is maintenance oriented, but the same principles will apply to construction jobs as well. They can be Gannted out as well. They're not repetitive, so there's a certain amount of estimating that you have to do, whereas with a maintenance job, you can actually measure the task times. But the principle is eliminating the incidental activity, and or if you can't eliminate it, at least reduce it. Eliminate or reduce the waste as far as you can to drive up the value added. There's one other concept that I'm going to throw out there just in the last couple of minutes that we've got, and that's an idea that I see everywhere where I see successful lean deployments, and that's organizing and maintaining a sense of order at the shop and with the vehicles and the offices. And the approach that lean-minded companies take is called 5S. It's called sift, sort, sweep, standardize, and sustain. Sift meaning don't keep anything that doesn't add any value. All the old broken pallets around the shop and plant pots and mowers that don't run anymore, get rid of them. Sort meaning get everything up off the floor, get it in shelves and cabinets and hooks, and find a place or create a place for everything. Sweep meaning clean it and keep it clean and keep it painted. There's a lot of value for clean. Standardize meaning putting labels or color codes on everything so that you know where everything goes forever. And sustaining meaning keep it up. And the reason I kind of want to throw this in there and communicate it, because what I believe that 5S does is it communicates a sense of discipline. And part of being successful with lean is to comply and be obedient to standard operating procedures, to understand that if there's a best way to do something, do it that way every time. And I believe that environments that are clean and well organized communicate a great sense of professionalism, and they communicate structure, and they can help leverage your efforts in terms of lean. Lean requires, and being successful with lean in our industry requires getting out on the job sites. It's not something that you can do from your desk. You got to get out on the job sites, take a look at what's going on, think about what's the value, what's the waste, how can we eliminate the waste, what are the training or planning pieces that you owe the guys that are out there delivering the value to help them to be more productive, and have we got the right equipment deployed? Lori, have we got any questions that we want to field?
We just got one, and let's see if we can pull it up. Is it, actually, no, they're just asking if this will be recorded, and it will be, so we will deal with that later.
Okay, all right. Well, if there's no more questions, we are about 46 minutes in, so I'll give everybody on the phone an extra 14 minutes back to your day. Lori, back to you.
All right, thank you so much for this great webinar. In order to improve our future webinars, please take a few moments to fill out our evaluations, which will appear on your screen at the end of this call. We appreciate your feedback, and I'd like to thank everyone, and particularly Ben, for participating in today's webinar, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori.